My daughter was scheduled for emergency surgery, and I sat in the waiting room for 6 hours with nothing but bad coffee and worse thoughts. By the time they rolled her into recovery, I was already half out of my mind with worry. What I didn't know was that the old man in the bed on the other side of the curtain had been listening to my son-in-law make phone calls for 3 hours. And before I left that hospital, he would hand me something I almost threw away. A warning that turned out to be the only thing standing between me and losing everything. My name is Edward. I'm 68 years old. I spent 31 years working as a floor supervisor at a steel fabrication plant outside Cincinnati. I've got rough hands, a bad knee, and a pension that Linda and I planned our whole retirement around. Linda passed 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer. Fast and brutal. She was gone in 7 months from the day they found it. After that, my daughter Amy was all I had left. My son moved to Portland years ago. We talk at Christmas, but Amy stayed close. Married Derek when she was 32, had 2 kids, lived 20 minutes from my house. She called me every Sunday, came over for dinner most Thursdays. She was Linda all over again in some ways. That laugh, that way of putting her hand on your arm when she was listening to you. I loved that girl more than I can say. Derek was another story. I never disliked him, not exactly. He was charming in that way that always made me slightly uncomfortable, the way a car salesman is charming. Smooth, quick with a compliment. He worked in commercial lending, always had a deal in the works, always had a reason why this investment or that one was a sure thing. I nodded along at family dinners. I kept my distance from his schemes. What I didn't see was what was happening right under my nose. It started the night Amy collapsed. She'd been having chest pains for weeks, attributed them to stress. Derek said she was fine. She said she was fine. Then one Thursday she called me from the bathroom floor of their house, barely able to speak, telling me to come. I called 911 on my way there. By the time I arrived, the ambulance was already pulling out of the driveway. They admitted her to St. Vincent's Medical Center downtown. Possible cardiac event, they said. They needed to run tests, monitor her overnight, maybe longer. I stayed. Of course I stayed. Derek arrived 2 hours after I did, which I filed away but didn't examine too closely. He'd been at a work dinner, he said. He couldn't get away immediately. He hugged Amy, talked to the doctor, asked all the right questions. Then he stepped out into the hallway, and I watched him through the small window in the door, phone already against his ear, already talking. Amy's room had 2 beds. The other was occupied by an elderly man who hadn't had a single visitor since I'd arrived. He was thin, white-haired, with alert brown eyes that didn't miss much. He introduced himself as Harold. Harold Watkins, retired, 74 years old. He'd spent 30 years as a branch manager at First Federal Savings before his knees gave out and his doctor gave him a speech about slowing down. I brought him coffee from the machine down the hall the second morning. Same reason I'd brought coffee to anyone who looked like they needed it. He thanked me. We talked about nothing important for a while. Amy was sleeping. Derek hadn't come back yet that morning. Harold watched me the way older men watch other older men, when they can tell something is wrong. He said quietly without any preamble, "The man who came to see your daughter yesterday, the younger one, he's planning something." I looked at him. He held my gaze. I was awake most of the night. That curtain doesn't block sound, just sight. He made phone calls in the hallway near my window. I heard things. I asked him what kind of things. He said your name, Harold told me. He said the words retirement account. He said, and I want to be exact here, because I'm not a man who repeats things loosely, he said. Once the old man signs it, we're done waiting. I sat with that for a moment. Then I told Harold what I told myself. Derek was in lending. He probably talked about accounts and signatures all day long. It was probably nothing. He was probably talking about a client. Harold nodded the way a man nods when he's already accepted that you won't believe him today. He said, maybe so. Then he reached to his bedside table and picked up a pen, an old one, heavy and silver, the kind they used to give executives. He held it out to me. Take this, he said. I asked him why. Because the next time someone asks you to sign something, Harold said, I want you to use it. It'll make you stop. Look twice. Think before you sign. I almost said no. Instead, I took the pen. Something in his face made me take it. They discharged Harold the following morning. He left before I was fully awake. When I pulled back the curtain, his bed was already stripped. On the pillow, there was a small notepad page, torn at the edge. 3 words in careful handwriting. Read everything twice. I folded it and put it in my pocket. Put Harold's pen in my shirt pocket. And I tried very hard not to think about what he'd said. Amy came home on day 4. Minor cardiac arrhythmia, stress-induced, manageable with medication and lifestyle changes. The doctor sat with both of us and was clear. No work stress, no financial stress, proper sleep. Take it seriously. I watched Derek nod and take notes on his phone. Attentive, concerned, perfect. 2 weeks passed. Amy was recovering well. I fell back into my routine. Sunday calls, Thursday dinners. Everything normal. Then Derek called me on a Tuesday afternoon. He wanted to come over. He had something he wanted to run by me. A real estate opportunity, he said. Commercial development, south of the city. His firm was involved at the ground level. He said he'd never ask me to look at something like this if he didn't believe in it completely. He said he wanted to protect the family's future. He sat at my kitchen table with a folder of papers, glossy summaries, projected returns, numbers that looked impressive if you didn't look too hard. He talked for 40 minutes. He was polished, professional. He answered every question before I could finish asking it. At the end, he slid a single page across the table. An authorization form. My signature would allow my name to be added to an investment vehicle tied to the development. Minor involvement, he said, mainly for tax purposes. It would protect my assets and Amy's inheritance. I picked up the pen from my shirt pocket, Harold's pen, and I stopped. I don't know exactly why. Call it muscle memory. Call it something Harold had planted in me. I set the pen down and said I wanted to take a few days to look it over. I said I'd have my accountant review it. Derek's face didn't change. He smiled. Said, of course. Said to take all the time I needed. But something happened in his eyes in that half second before the smile came. I saw it the way you see a light flicker in a dark room. It was gone before I could name it. He left the papers with me. That night I read through everything. Then I called my accountant, a woman named Gail who Linda and I had used for 20 years. She came over the next afternoon, went through the papers slowly. Her face stayed professional for a while. Then it didn't. She pointed to 3 specific lines buried in the 3rd page. This structure, she said carefully, would effectively allow a co-signatory to initiate transfers out of the linked account with single-party authorization. Meaning, if I signed this, Derek could move money without my knowledge or consent. I asked her if that was unusual. She said she'd never put a client's signature on something like this. Not ever. I thanked her. I walked her out. I stood in my driveway for a long time after her car was gone. I thought about Harold. Once the old man signs it, we're done waiting. I didn't sign the papers. I also didn't tell Derek right away. I told him I needed more time. He said no problem. He said he understood completely. That same week, I started paying closer attention. I pulled out every financial statement I had. I went through 12 months of bank records. I'd given Derek limited power of attorney 18 months ago, after Linda died, when I was too raw to manage everything myself, and he'd offered to help. I'd thought it was kindness. I'd thought it was my son-in-law stepping up for the family. I found 3 transfers I didn't recognize. A total of $42,000, moved in small amounts over 14 months, to an LLC I'd never heard of. An LLC, I would later learn, that Derek had opened in his brother's name. I sat in my kitchen with those statements spread across the table, and I thought about Amy in that hospital bed. I thought about whether Amy knew. I didn't want to think about that. I called a lawyer, a man named Curtis Webb who handled estate work. I'd used him to update my will after Linda passed. I told him what I'd found. I told him about the papers Derek had brought. I told him about Harold Watkins and what he'd overheard. Curtis listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said two things. First, he said freeze the power of attorney immediately. He'd file the paperwork that afternoon. Second, he gave me the name of a private investigator. He said her name was Diane Moss. He said she was thorough and discreet. I met Diane at a coffee shop on Reading Road 3 days later. She was 50-something, practical, with the kind of eyes that had seen enough to not be easily surprised. I walked her through everything. She told me what she'd look for: financial trail, business connections, any civil litigation, any pattern of behavior. She came back to me in 11 days. She sat across from me at that same coffee shop and opened a folder, and I could tell from the way she placed it on the table that what was inside was going to be hard to look at. Derek had done this before. His first marriage, a woman in Louisville named Karen. They'd been married 4 years. During that time, Derek had moved roughly $80,000 from Karen's savings and a joint investment account into a series of LLCs. Karen had discovered it, filed for divorce, attempted to press charges. The case had been settled out of court. Non-disclosure agreement. Derek had walked away. He'd met Amy 14 months later. I sat there, looking at the documents Diane had assembled. Karen's divorce records, the redacted settlement, Derek's business filings, the shell companies. Diane had also found credit bureau irregularities. Derek's personal credit was a wreck. He was carrying $230,000 in debt, most of it from a failed development deal from 3 years ago. And the LLC he'd sent my $42,000 to? The one in his brother's name? He'd used the same structure in Louisville. I asked Diane the question I hadn't been able to ask myself yet. I asked if she thought Amy was involved. Diane took a long moment. She said she'd found no evidence that Amy had knowledge of the LLCs or the transfers. She said that based on the Louisville pattern, Derek operated by keeping his partners completely in the dark. She said Karen had been blindsided too. She said that didn't mean I wouldn't need to tell Amy. It just meant Amy was likely as much a victim as I was. I drove home and sat in the house Linda and I had lived in for 27 years, and I tried to figure out how to tell my daughter that the man she'd built a life with had done this before and was doing it again. Curtis and Diane recommended the same thing. Don't confront Derek. Not yet. Not until the asset protection was in place. Freeze accounts. Revoke power of attorney. Put the house in a protected trust. Change every password, every PIN, and then watch. I did all of it in 4 days. Curtis worked fast. By the end of the week, Derek couldn't access anything connected to my name. On the 5th day, Derek called me. His voice was easy, warm. He asked how I was doing. He asked about the investment papers. Said he didn't want to push, but the window was closing. Said the other partners were asking about my commitment level. I told him I'd decided to pass. I said I appreciated him thinking of me, but the timing wasn't right. A pause, shorter than it should have been. Then, sure, Ed. No worries at all. I respect that. That night, Diane sent me a text. He pulled your credit report today. He's checking what you have. I called Curtis. We moved the house into the trust the next morning. 3 days later, Amy called me. She sounded strange, careful, like she was reading from something. She asked me why I'd revoked Derek's power of attorney. She said Derek had mentioned it in passing, said it had come up in some paperwork. She said she just wanted to understand. I told her I wanted to talk to her in person. She came over that Thursday without Derek. She sat at the same table where I'd spread out those bank statements, and I showed her everything. The transfers, the LLC, the Louisville records, Diane's file. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she started to cry. Not dramatically, just quietly. The way you cry when something you've been half suspecting confirms itself and the confirmation is worse than the suspicion. She said, I thought it was work stress. I thought he was just overwhelmed. He kept saying things would get better once a deal came through. I told her about Karen. She hadn't known about Karen. After that, she couldn't stop shaking. I want you to know that watching your daughter fall apart across a kitchen table is one of the hardest things a father can do. I wanted to absorb every bit of it for her. I couldn't. All I could do was sit there and not look away. We talked for 4 hours. By the end of it, she was steady again, in the way that people get steady when they've moved past the shock. and into something harder and more purposeful. She said she wanted to see a lawyer. She said she wanted to protect her children. She said she needed to do this right. I told her I was with her every step. What neither of us knew was that Derek had already moved to the next stage. Curtis called me 9 days later. He'd been contacted by a life insurance company, Meridian Life, flagging an application for verification. Someone had applied for a $750,000 term policy in my name. The beneficiary was Derek. Application dated 6 weeks ago. My name. My medical history. Pulled from Street. Vincent's records from when I'd been treated for a minor cardiac episode of my own 2 years prior. My signature. Forged so precisely that the insurance company's intake reviewer had accepted it without question. Curtis read me the details over the phone. I listened. When he was done, I sat very still and thought about what it meant that Derek had been planning this for at least 6 weeks. That while he was sitting at my kitchen table with those investment papers, while he was calling me to check on Amy, while he was sitting at my dinner table eating the pot roast I'd made from Linda's recipe, he'd already filed a policy that was worth $750,000 if I stopped breathing. I called Diane. She said she'd already started looking when Curtis contacted her. She said she'd found something else. She said, "Ed, your car was at Derek's cousin's garage 2 weeks ago. Derek drove it there, said he needed to borrow it for an errand. It was there for 90 minutes. I asked her what she meant by that. The cousin does custom work, she said. Off-the-books stuff. I talked to a mechanic who used to work there. She paused. I want you to have your brakes checked before you drive that car anywhere. I had the car towed to a shop I'd used for years. The mechanic called me within an hour. He put me on hold, came back, told me to come in. When I got there, he showed me what he'd found. The brake line had been partially compromised. Not cut through, just weakened. The kind of failure that would develop over 15 to 20 minutes of normal driving and then stop working without warning. I was 68 years old. I had a minor cardiac history. If I'd been on the highway when those brakes failed, it would have looked exactly like what Derek needed it to look like. I sat in that mechanic's waiting room and I thought about Harold Watkins, about the pen in my shirt pocket that I hadn't stopped carrying, about 3 words on a notepad page. Read everything twice. I called Curtis, and I said, I want to end this. Here is what we did. Curtis contacted Detective Renee Burgess at Cincinnati PD's Financial Crimes Unit. She reviewed the case over 48 hours and upped a formal investigation. She pulled Derek's phone records, his business filings, his connection to the garage. She spoke to the mechanic. She spoke to Gail, my accountant. Then she called me and said what I already knew. What we had was strong. But for the most serious charges, the ones that went beyond fraud into intent to cause harm, she wanted something cleaner. A statement Derek made himself. On record. She asked me if I was willing to have a final conversation with Derek. Recorded. Controlled. She'd be close. Her team would be ready. I said yes. We staged it carefully. I called Derek and told him I'd reconsidered the investment. I told him I'd made a mistake, that I could see what he was trying to do for the family, and that I wanted to talk it over. He agreed to meet at my house the following afternoon with no hesitation. His voice had that warmth in it again, that salesman warmth. He sat at my kitchen table for the last time. He brought new papers, a revised version of the authorization form, the same structure underneath dressed in different language. He slid it across to me. He explained it again. Patient, practiced, friendly. I picked up Harold's pen. I said, Before I sign this, Derek, I need to ask you something. He said, Sure, Ed. Anything. I said, Karen. The name landed on the table between us like something heavy. His face didn't crack immediately. I'll give him that. He held the smile for almost 2 full seconds. Then, something shifted, and what was underneath wasn't friendly at all. He tried to deflect. He tried the work stress version, the misunderstanding version. I let him talk for a few minutes. Then I opened the folder I'd kept on the chair beside me, the one with Diane's report, the bank statements, the LLC filings, a copy of the life insurance application, the mechanic's written assessment of my brake line. I laid them out one at a time. I watched his face change with each page, By the end, he wasn't trying to explain anymore. He stood up. He said, quietly, and without any of the warmth left, "You don't know what you're doing." I said, "I know exactly what I'm doing." He said, "Amy will never forgive you for this." I told him Amy already knew. That's when the front door opened. Detective Burgess. 2 officers behind her. She had everything she needed. The recording, the documents, the mechanic's report, the insurance application, the financial trail going back 14 months. Derek looked at me one last time. I held his gaze and said nothing. They took him out through my front door. I stood in the kitchen where Linda and I had raised our family, and I didn't feel like I'd won anything. I felt like I'd survived something. Those are very different feelings. The case moved quickly after that. Karen came forward once she heard. Her non-disclosure agreement didn't cover criminal proceedings. Her testimony about the Louisville pattern was, according to Curtis, devastating to Derek's defense. Amy cooperated fully. She turned over financial records, email threads, everything she had access to. She moved out of the house she and Derek had shared and brought the kids to stay with me for 6 weeks while things sorted themselves out. My house was full again in a way it hadn't been since Linda. My grandchildren at the kitchen table every morning. Their noise and their mess and their completely ordinary needs were the most healing thing I'd experienced in 4 years. Derek was charged with financial fraud, forgery, criminal conspiracy, and tampering with a vehicle. He accepted a plea deal, 11 years. He'd be in his mid-50s when he got out. The day sentencing was handed down, Amy and I drove home together. We didn't talk much. She held my hand across the center console at one red light, and I thought about Linda, about what she would say. I think she would say that the fact that Amy was sitting beside me was the whole point, that this was the thing worth protecting. I found Harold Watkins 3 weeks after the sentencing. It took some doing. A few calls to street. Vincent's, which got me nowhere for privacy reasons. And then a call to a former colleague of mine who knew people in the records department and owed me a favor from 1994. Harold lived in a retirement community in Hyde Park, 20 minutes from my house. I brought him a carton of good coffee and a piece of apple cake I'd made from Linda's recipe. He opened his apartment door and looked at me for a moment. Then he smiled, slow and warm, and said, "I hoped you'd come." We sat at his small kitchen table and I told him everything. He listened the way he'd listened in the hospital, with complete attention and no hurry. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was glad I'd taken the pen. I asked him how he'd known. He said he hadn't known. Not exactly. He said he'd spent 30 years in banking and he'd heard a particular kind of phone call before. The kind where someone is managing a timeline, checking on how long they have before someone notices. He said Derek hadn't been talking loudly, but the gap in the curtain near Harold's window had been doing him favors. He'd heard the words old man and signature and clean, and he knew the shape of what he was hearing, even if he didn't know the specifics. I told him I'd almost brushed off everything he said. He nodded like that wasn't a surprise. He said, "We don't want to believe it, especially with family. Believing it means grieving something, and grief is hard." I took the pen out of my shirt pocket. I'd been carrying it for 4 months. I set it on the table between us. He shook his head. He said, "Keep it. You know what it's for now." We sat for another hour. He told me about his own life, about his kids, about the small ways money had divided families he'd watched from across bank counters for decades. He said it never stopped being sad, no matter how many times you saw it. When I stood to leave, I asked if I could come back and visit. He said he'd be irritated if I didn't. Here is what life looks like now. Amy is in therapy. She says it's helping. She's back in her own apartment with the kids. We have dinner twice a week, and she calls me most mornings on her way to work. She's different than she was before. More careful, more willing to say hard things out loud, but still fundamentally herself. Still Linda's laugh. Still that hand on your arm. My accounts are intact. The house is mine. Curtis set up a trust that protects everything properly. Gail does a quarterly review. I never gave anyone power of attorney again. I volunteer twice a month at a senior center in Blue Ash. I started because they needed people to help older residents navigate financial paperwork, understand what they were signing, ask the right questions. I started because of Harold's pen. I've been doing it for 8 months. Last month, a woman named Dorothy came in with documents her son had left with her to sign. I sat with her for 2 hours, and by the end, we'd identified 2 authorization clauses that would have given him unchecked access to her savings account. She looked at me when I explained what those clauses meant. She was 81 years old, and her son was all she had left, and she'd almost signed it because he'd told her it was routine. She asked me how I knew what to look for. I told her about Harold. I told her about the hospital and the pen and 3 words on a notepad page. I told her it's okay to slow down, to ask questions, to take a few days before you sign anything, no matter who hands it to you or how much you love them. I told her that the people who love you will wait, and the ones who won't wait are the ones you need to know about. I still have Harold's pen. It sits on my desk at home next to a photo of Linda and one of Amy and the kids from last Thanksgiving. Some mornings I pick it up and I think about what it cost me to learn what I know. And some mornings I think about Dorothy and the other people who've come through that center, and I think that maybe what it cost wasn't entirely wasted. Linda used to say that the things that hurt us the most are the ones that make us most useful to other people, if we let them. I didn't understand what she meant for a long time. I think I understand it now. If you're watching this and something feels wrong, trust that feeling. You're not being paranoid. You're not being disloyal. You're being careful with the life you've built, and that life is worth being careful with. I almost lost everything because I couldn't imagine that someone I trusted was counting on exactly that. Don't make the same mistake. Slow down. Read everything twice. And if a stranger in a hospital bed hands you something and says, "Keep this," keep it. You might need it more than you know.